Montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, 10 minutes later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later. Just then.
What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.
3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later.
1 hour later.
1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
5,000 celebrities later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later.
5 billion years later.
The next morning. Later. Later that night. The next evening. 1 operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas.
7 years later.
Several long days later. Many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. 1 beautiful Christmas morning later. The next month.